Shall we refill the tea?
A tea fill? Oh, is there nothing left?
There is enough. There's enough.
Okay.
It's just a teeny tiny cup of tea.
I am running quite low on milk, so if you do want another cup of tea, you're going to have to want it disgusting, because I've literally...
Terracotta.
Yeah, or I've not got any other...
That's fine, baby.
Okay. I'm sufficiently caffeinated right now.
Wait. Do you remember when I said that 1 cup of tea was worth 4 cups of coffee?
Did you know that 1 cup of tea is worth 10,000 cups of coffee? Hello everyone, welcome to Art and.
My name's Nathan.
And my name is Sophie. We are both fine artists. We're both fine. And we're both artists. And we decided together that we wanted to make a podcast because there's a bit of a gap in the market. There's no real talks about fine art.
People need to be talking about art, and we're speaking from painters' perspectives, which is really, really important. We're not only going to be talking about us as painters and other painters, we are going to be talking about sculptors and drawers and makers of things. But painting feels like a little bit of a dying...
It's a bit of a dying art. It's a bit of a weird one. There's lots of... I think the birth of being original is great.
Yeah.
But also, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
So true. So there's quite an interesting perspective that we're learning. So today's episode is art and sex.
Fabulous.
That was very well timed.
Thank you. I also think as well that, so we have both been, so this year we both graduated with first class degrees. And I think thank you. I think one of our pet peeves when it comes to the world of academia is how not easy it is to understand anything. And I would like to present our knowledge collectively to be understood and digested by everyone, because I'm fed up. I'm so fed up of this kind of jargon.
Like elitist.
Yeah.
Classist.
And just to kind of, it doesn't make you if I go, oh my god, I can't understand this, you must be so well versed in your education, I switch off. I don't care anymore. And I think as well, the main reason this podcast can be so beneficial both ways is because it's encouraged me to do more research. I am a figurative oil painter. I've been painting for about a decade, but I've been painting like as an actual painter for maybe about 5 or 6 years.
To be fair, like on that principle, we've both been painting since we came out of the womb.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it was any good though.
Yeah. I've been speaking for, well, God, almost all my life. I know many words. So I've been fairly serious about art and painting for, just a while. Yes, I'm a figurative oil painter, and I quite like making works that can be seen and absorbed and understood by as many people as possible, as wide of an audience as possible.
You're very, like, human experience driven.
Yeah, I want to make sure that my experiences, I know, aren't just intrinsic to me, but because I've felt them, I know them and understand them, I then want to depict them for other people to then...
And visually, the way in which you depict your work really allows for an interesting interaction from the way your audience absorbs it. So how do you figuratively paint?
There's like a little bit of inspiration of hieroglyph. It's just this really theatrical and really expressive. And...
very, very symbolic.
Yes.
Like your work has so much symbolism in it.
And I think having that visual communication so kind of comes so easily and recognisable. Obviously, I know hieroglyphics are very fucking complicated and we don't really know what they mean today.
We don't, anyway.
But the Egyptians, all over that, they loved it.
So what you're saying is, in ancient Egypt, you would be a very successful artist.
She would have thrived, yeah.
However,
I would have earned so much money if I was born 3,000 years ago. The thing that makes me want to make is when I go to a gallery or I'll go and see a piece of art and there's a feeling inside that I think's never going to happen again until it happens again.
Oh, that feeling when it happened to us when we saw Alice Neel's
at the Barbican
solo exhibition at the Barbican in London in March 2023, so earlier this year.
There's just a stirring feeling in me that if I see something great, I go, I think I can change the world. Like, there's something within this where I'm so moved by it, and I find it so fascinating that something completely still and in a way two-dimensional can be, and also can be hundreds of years old, can eviscerate such a fresh, unique and prominent feeling within me.
Yes. And it's we have not been alive for very long in the grand scheme of everything.
Absolutely. And it's something that I know I've experienced, and I know how much it's changed me.
I mean, I remember both Sophie and I have been to Paris, but at separate times, and you went to the Musée d'Orsay.
Oh,
so when she got home from her holiday, one of the first things we talked about was how you saw an original Van Gogh. Van Gogh? Van Gogh. Yes, you saw an original Van Gogh.
Yes. I saw lots of original Van Goghs.
I remember us getting very emotional in that conversation. We get very emotional people.
Yeah.
And yeah, that changed your life.
Yeah, I cried like a baby. I was I was just so moved by it all, and I think that the power that can have is something that is very, very valuable. And
if we have one chance at doing that to other people, I think the one thing we both paint, the one reason we both truly paint, is to create an emotional reaction.
They do say that, I've heard word on the artist street is that the thing of art is to evoke feelings.
Yeah, I've said since day one, I don't care actually if you love or you hate my work. I care that you feel something.
If you're bored, I failed.
Yeah,
just
we've
feel
done
strongly
something
about
wrong.
it.
Yeah. So in terms of the way your work looks,
yes,
of course, for our visual audience, we'll insert some shameless pluggy pictures.
Oh, fabulous.
However, for our podcast listeners,
yes,
what does your work look like?
So I paint basically exclusively naked people. I think the reason for this maybe is because I struggle to dress myself in the morning, so obviously not going to make that permanent decision for those people.
So true.
Those poor bastards. But also, I think when I'm painting a lot about vulnerability and emotions and experiences, I think just stripping a person down to quite literally their bare form just helps articulate that message a little bit better, I think.
And that's also really interesting because we are going to be talking about art and sex in this episode, and sex is going to come up very, very soon. And it's quite interesting that is your approach to nudity and naked people.
Yes, because with the nude versus the naked, I have never once thought to paint anything towards my viewpoint or experience of sex.
Yes.
Despite painting naked people all the time.
Your naked people, Soph's really, really inspired by the Expressionists as a collective, and particularly German Expressionism.
Yes.
And I feel like what you adopt from that is some beautiful, exaggerated proportions.
Yes, yeah.
Lots of hands, lots of big hands.
Yeah, just kind of...
massive women.
Ginormous women. Kind of very big shoulders, very big hands, very large eyes. I think it just helps articulate emotions, especially since there's quite a lot of the macabre or melancholy that I might want to articulate. And if there's someone crying and they've got these huge, beautiful eyes, and I think it just kind of helps tie in the message quite a lot. And I think with the Expressionists, what I loved so much is that they, in a way, they were doing realism of their reality. They were painting their reality.
Yes.
And I think...
And that was obscured.
Yeah.
By many, many things.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reality at the time of what they were painting, how they felt, not what they saw. But yeah, I think it's just quite interesting because as much as I paint naked people with no knowing sexual undertone, I think the way you paint nudity and nakedness does have a sexual tenderness to it.
It does. So this is very much how we're different, because I think our descriptions on paper somewhat sound a little bit similar. I'm also a figurative oil painter. I paint pretty much exclusively naked people as well. However, I am a realism oil painter. We talk a lot about how boring realism is boring, good realism is good. There is such a thing as boring realism, and I completely agree. But I have this very, very, very kind of personally charged, but also like socially charged sexualization and sexual experience that feeds my practice. So I've painted some extremes. I've painted like what essentially looks like pornography.
I would say it is pornography. It's erotica.
Incredibly pornographic erotica style of work. That was probably about 3 to 4 years ago. I become a little bit more subtle as I've gotten a bit older.
Yeah, I think the idea of the tender and the emotional and the intimate aspects of sex have
Intimacy,
kind of come forward.
Intimacy drives everything I paint. I am in a sexually open relationship with my partner. We've known each other for nearly a year now. And we've been open since day one. But also before that, I had quite interesting, quite fluid and dynamic sexual relationships with people. And that is a very, very big driver for me. I do not believe that nudity is intrinsically sexual at all. I don't think, because I don't look at Sophie's work, for example, and I didn't look at a lot of Alice Neel's work, and I've also got one of her books here, so we'll have a look at that. I didn't look at some of Alice Neel's paintings, a lot of which were nude, as sexual paintings. You wouldn't necessarily, I'm not going to speak for the whole world, but I wouldn't necessarily look at any of Lucien Freud's nude paintings and deem them sexual, but they were nude.
This is what's interesting about the subject of sex, is that in the Venn diagram, you can tell how much sex I'm having if I'm using fucking Venn diagrams, is in the Venn diagram of everything, the things that can include and also be so far away from sex, i.e. nudity. There's so many things that can straddle on the side of sex and almost like anti-sex as well. Like being naked isn't equivalent to being sexual, but you have to, for the most part, you have to be naked to have sex.
And this is what's also incredibly interesting, is we are both British, if you can't tell.
Hello, we're literally drinking tea
We're
right now.
literally, like, look at this.
Hello, governor.
A cup of tea. And I think it is very, very intrinsic to British culture, particularly, that nudity is a big problem in this country. We don't know how to act. Our sexual education is awful.
I feel like we just come out of the womb embarrassed. I feel like
we do.
British culture is very.
We literally come out like this. We're like, ooh.
You just have to apologise for big. Oh, sorry. Oh, good heavens.
Oh, sorry. Just, no, you go. No, you.
Pardon me. Like, it's just all so apologetic, and I think that adds into this idea of shame and adds into this idea of being sexually not very confident.
Yes, an incredibly
higgledy-piggledy.
The sort of prim and proper depiction. This is really important. Depiction of history, of British history. The reality is we've always had sex.
Yeah.
Sex has been around since day dot.
Yeah. That's kind of the whole thing.
Whether you believe in Adam and Steve,
or
whether you believe in the birth of the universe.
Yeah.
When humankind took step on this earth, one of the first things we did was have sex. And that doesn't mean that every single human these days is a sexual person. You know, asexuality is considerably more talked about. But in the broad spectrum of things, we are an incredibly sexual species. And culturally, British artists and British history and the way our monarchy is kind of depicted throughout history is we've got this really, really, like, tight kind of, sort of feel to how we've approached sex. The way in which sex is discussed with, like, children throughout education is bad. Like, we do not have a good sex education system in this country, and I think that's really important when talking about art. But one thing that we really believe is art is the only depiction of humankind and human culture throughout all of history. You've got archaeologists who dig up bones, but the first thing you've actually got, and the first thing we actually found, was paintings inside of caves. And people might go, well, they just, they drew stick men with red pigment and on cave walls. They did, but that is art. And we started making and we started picture making from when we started having sex. So I would say they are intrinsically linked.
Yeah, I'd say that this idea of documentation and mark making, especially so when you look at cave paintings, it's what people were doing at the time. And what they were doing is hunting massive mammals with spears
and procreating.
Yeah. So yeah, erotic themes have always been present in art and documentation. Human genitalia has been found in cave paintings as drawings, not just like on the floor. They've been found in cave paintings and stone carvings that are up to 12,000 years old.
12,000 years. And that's a minimum. That's just like how much access we have to human history.
That's just the stuff that's survived.
Exactly.
With that, there's a lot of evidence of sexual drawings, sexual scenes in ancient Greece. They were a big producer of erotica. Walls of buildings, on ceramics, even moulded into the surfaces of household tools, which I thought was interesting.
The ancient Greeks knew how to party.
Just household tools for me. Is
just having like a wang on your hammer.
Yeah, or a spoon. I don't know.
Darling, can you please pass me the vagina spoons? We're having soup. Also, most men, if not all men, in ancient Greece were openly bisexual. This is also a big patriarchal thing, though. It wasn't really deemed like women throughout all of history, right up until like the 20th century. So within the last 100 years, women being either lesbian or bisexual is just not really recognised. And it's just...
They were really good friends, Nathan.
They were such good friends,
These two
Sophie.
women that were exclusively together, had a house together.
Never married.
Never had children. And just lived together at a time where it probably wasn't the best time to be gay. Were great friends.
They were besties.
They were such good friends, and they didn't even need a man. They didn't have husbands. They didn't want them. They were fine. They had friendship, is what they had.
Very, very close friendship.
And I think this is something that I would quite like to get maybe a little bit deeper into if we do have time later on, that art and sex is very, very closely linked to queerness. And I think we wouldn't have the depictions of sex we have in art history if it wasn't for queer people.
Yes. And also, mini coming out statement. I identify as a queer man. I'm in a gay relationship with a cis man. And I am also a trans man. And we'll be talking a little bit about that.
We co-ran a LGBTQ plus society in uni.
We did. We did a big exhibition. It was called the Lavender Exhibition.
It was very gay.
It was very gay. It was really good.
And so I'm a bisexual woman, but I'm in a heteronormative relationship, essentially.
Yes, I think that as a cisgender woman in a bisexual relationship with a cisgender man, there is a lot of bi-erasure. And we're going to talk about bi-erasure a lot.
Absolutely.
So I've got a book here, which is monumental. And it's a Lucien Freud book. And it's published by...
Aquavella.
Thank you. And it's got some amazing photographs of Lucien Freud's nude paintings, essentially. And he handles paint very, very interestingly.
God, Jay, you can really see
it's rough.
It's really cakey, isn't it?
And normally, what I've found in my personal analysis of Lucien Freud paintings is that the figures, especially of the women he paints, their bodies tend to be painted smoother and their faces tend to be painted incredibly gritty. And it's very layered and it's very sort of clunky. And I would argue that there's possibly a lot of misogyny in that.
Yeah, I think maybe saving the really smooth, perfect, lovely texture for a woman's body when she's in the scud is maybe, you know, a preferred thing, especially through the male gaze. You've got that layer as well. But I do think, especially...
This is the one I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, wow.
And I really struggle in this painting.
Oh, in this painting.
Which is titled Rhea, Naked Portrait, 2006 to 2007. It's oil on canvas, 34 by 64 inches, and you can find it in Lucien Freud Monumental, the book, or you can just give it a good Google. And I really struggle to look at her face, because the way he has handled the physical substance of oil paint...
It's easier to look at her naked body in a suggestive position.
Honestly, her face is disgusting.
She looks like she's got scurvy.
Yeah, like it's quite repulsing.
Yeah.
But her body...
is so supple and...
Like, there is
hairless.
Yeah, she's completely hairless. And there is some texture. There's a textural element to all of it because you just paint quite thick.
Nothing like it's on the face.
No, and that's really interesting.
I think that's very
because for me, this painting does not talk about sex.
No.
This painting talks about the male gaze, misogyny, and objectification, and that's how I absorb his paintings.
This is what's interesting, is going back to when I was at the Musée d'Orsay, I saw so many oil nudes of women that, whether they knew or not, were being viewed through a sexual lens to be put on display. It was almost a power thing.
Yeah.
Rather than it being work about the act of sex or the initiation of sex or the tenderness and the feeling and the ecstasy that comes with sex. It was more this idea of, look how supple and soft and naked this person is.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what spoke first.
And what's also interesting is, because Sophie and I have very different experiences as sexual beings in our relationships. So if you're in a completely sexually and emotionally monogamous relationship with your partner.
Yes, yeah.
I am in a emotionally monogamous but sexually very, very open relationship with my partner. Mm-hmm. And I think that potentially feeds into my experiences as a sexual being. And I wondered if you felt that your experiences as a woman and how this kind of painting and this exposure, like, we've got a close-up of this and it's gross. It's horrible.
She looks like a pile of cornflakes. It's really, and I know what you mean. I don't want to look at her face.
I don't want to. So I'd rather look at, like, because there is. Don't get me wrong. There is texture in her body.
But this, I don't understand how he's got to that point, because it's so much easier to look at her pubis and look at her breasts and look at her
like
soft
to like look
thighs
at her
and her bum.
thighs. Yeah, like. This is a challenge. So yeah, I wondered if you felt or feel like your experiences as a woman being exposed to work like this, like going through the Musée d'Orsay and knowing that the paintings of women tend to be incredibly performative.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience because I went with my friend and we were both women, like young women, going into this museum and just looking at these hairless, supple, almost like teenage looking
sort
bodies.
Of very angelic, very, very softly painted.
Almost like prepubescent, essentially.
Because like the majority of these were or are still Renaissance works.
Yeah, like Renaissance-y era.
Yeah.
And they all had basically invisible nipples, like you couldn't see any. There was nothing about them that felt real. Like
three-dimensional.
And it just was... what I find very interesting is that we talk a lot about sort of standards and sexualization of social media and influencers and, you know, clothing getting a bit more skimpy and things like that. But actually, looking around, the status quo was very much the same of all these women that were white, angelic, prepubescent, nippleless beings, hairless beings that had their skin had no imperfections. They were so soft.
So you've got like that depiction of women that you're absorbing as a woman.
Yeah.
And they are also the paintings that do take up a lot of space in permanent collections.
Some of them were huge.
Yeah.
There was like a physical woman.
Like every gallery you walk into that isn't a rolling exhibition contemporary art gallery, places like the Tate.
Large.
They have very, very big permanent collections, and a lot of the paintings in a lot of permanent collections, unless they're landscape paintings, tend to be these very Renaissance-esque paintings of women.
Yes.
So you've got that extreme, but you've also got the extreme of Lucien Freud, for example.
Yeah.
Who objectively has painted a lot of women very nude in some very not great ways.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the sexual lens is that it kind of doesn't matter whether both people are in on it. If one person wants to view the other one sexually, that's kind of endgame. So with the paintings I saw in the Musée d'Orsay, the painter wanted to look at the woman in a sexual way, so it had a sexual undertone.
Yeah.
And I think that with some of Freud's paintings, there's that element of nudity that's kind of got shock value, because the exposure of... There's one thing sort of painting a pubis or like the side of a breast, but to paint like open genitalia, like what's inside your body, and it being so graphic and so realism based, especially going back to what you were saying about oil paint, about the textures that are used within that.
Yeah.
If you're painting genitalia and you're laying it on really thick, whatever, it feels very graphic and it
using
feels very sexual.
What I gained from looking at Lucien Freud's style of painting is it looks like he uses lumps of old paint with lumps of new paint, and he just goes over and over and over and just creates these. And don't get me wrong, fantastic painter. Doesn't make him a fantastic person.
No, very few of them are.
Let's talk about somebody who we think is a fantastic painter.
Who's that?
Alice Neel.
Alice Neel! Sorry.
And
You
I've
were
got her
looking at
book
me
here.
expecting me to be like really telepathic with you, and I was just like, no idea. No, honestly, this is what was really good about Alice Neel, is that when we went to go see her exhibition at the Barbican, there was elements of sexuality that were really, really, really prevalent. There was elements of like transgender people, sex workers, cross-dressers.
And Alice Neel was a painter throughout essentially the whole of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So the 1900s.
All of her life, she was depicting people, and she was very much sort of like by the people, for the people.
Oh, 100%. She described herself as a humanist.
Which I think is really lovely.
She loved people.
Yeah.
It's this painting, and it's called Nazis Murdered Jews. And we saw this painting for exactly what it is in the Barbican. And this was not one of her more nude and sexual and frivolous paintings. It is incredibly political.
It was sort of slapped in the middle of stuff she did in her early life, and then when because she was a humanist, she was very, very accepting, and she had a really diverse set of people that she knew. And the fact that that was painted in 1936, so 3 years before World War II, is very, very moving.
Incredibly. It was quite scary to look at. And I think that really enthusiastic political nature to her paintings was taken into her figurative portraiture. So she didn't always exclusively paint nude people. She painted a lot of portraits with clothed people. She painted children. She painted young and old people.
Yeah.
She painted a lot of people from minority groups. So she painted black people, she painted brown people, she painted queer people, she painted transgender people.
There's one painting that comes to mind of hers, and it was towards the end of the exhibition at the Barbican.
It might be in
and
here,
it's
actually.
It's someone kneeling down, and they have their clitoris pierced.
Oh, yeah.
And they're wearing kind of crotchless underwear, and you can kind of see it dangling down. And they're wearing kind of a bit of a kind of like showgirl costume wear.
Yeah, she's...
And it just exuded so much confidence and sexuality. And she was like in her 60s, 70s when she painted that.
Yeah.
And it was just so interesting how someone who... I don't think Alice Neel was particularly sexual in and of herself, but it didn't stop her from...
experiencing it. They weren't all arguably great paintings, but they... when curated and exhibited together, they really said and felt everything they needed to say and feel.
Yeah.
Now, with Alice Neel, I would not argue that every single one of Alice Neel's individual paintings, because who would for an artist, felt like incredible.
Yeah, they're not all winners.
And they're not all proportionally great. They're not all... They don't all have the same energy to them, but the way in which they were curated in the Barbican, hands down, that exhibition changed my life.
Yeah.
Because there was something about walking through that space, and it was essentially multiple rooms. If you've never been into the Barbican building, really, really recommend it. Absolutely stunning. They always have beautiful exhibitions on there. you essentially walked around a square space with multiple rooms and sort of segments, and you were walking through this woman's whole life, from when she painted from birth till death. And one of her last paintings, which was from 1980, so it's not the very last, but one of her much, much later paintings, is a self-portrait of her nude. And it took her 5 years.
Yeah, it took a lot of attempts
to paint this painting. And it's not sexual. And I don't know if it feels not sexual because she's an old lady.
I think it's, for me, because it was one of the first paintings you saw when you walked into the exhibition.
Yes, it was really interestingly placed, wasn't it? It was literally one of the first ones you saw was her nude self-portrait, and this
then
was
it kind of walked you through the chronology of it. But I think it's her. You can feel the tension in her body. You can feel the tension that she's so uncomfortable with being viewed in that way as a naked old lady. She
said in a videoed interview which played on a loop in the exhibition that she's so glad she did it, but she never was ready to do it before and she'd never do it again.
Yeah.
So yeah, really, really interesting.
And this is what can be so overwhelming inside and outside of art about sex and being viewed sexually is one thing that's very, very overwhelming. This is certainly the case for me when I became sort of on the cusp of 17, 18, as I was getting really panicked because I knew I was old enough to have sex, which meant people might be viewing me sexually, and that made me really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think with someone like Alice Neel making a painting where she's very uncomfortable with the idea of being seen naked, and because being naked can mean so many things, of being vulnerable.
I mean, how many of us have had nightmares about being naked in places? I had a nightmare last night that my piano teacher joined our Zoom call and I was naked.
And it's just this idea of being vulnerable, this idea of like being seen in a way you don't want to be seen.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is a good segue to talk more about the sex element in a different way.
Yes.
So Yayoi Kusama, who is the lovely polka dot pumpkin lady that we all know and love today. However,
if you've never had the privilege of absorbing her work, you just Google it, go to the Tate, do anything you can, because it is incredible.
So Yayoi Kusama, very troubled start to life, and she's one of those artists that there was a series of events that led to her having the life she has now, her living the way she lives now, and essentially she had quite a troubled childhood and a very interesting exposure to sex at a very young age, as her father was having an affair and her mother used to make her go and spy on her father as he was being unfaithful, to report back to her mother about the shenanigans he was getting into. So,
which is, of course, we can acknowledge this, especially now, that is an incredibly over-sexualised childhood and a very, very worrying kind of exposure to a parent in a sexual manner.
Yeah, there were so many things that were way beyond her maturity level. I think she was literally 6 or 7. So it was something that she saw and absorbed and then had to respond to. And the way she responded was being so fearful of sex, so fearful of phallic shapes, because it was such a stark and brash exposure to what sex was. And even though Kusama doesn't make work about sex, and she doesn't make work that's sexual, the work she makes now was influenced by her exposure to sex.
And arguably, what one might describe from a outside perspective is elements of trauma inform our practices. And that's not necessarily the same for every single artist, but I can speak from that experience, even as somebody who paints very beautiful, very, emotionally, vulnerably charged, pretty paintings. My trauma definitely informs that. So I can imagine for somebody like Yayoi Kusama, that kind of trauma that's instilled in an overly sexualized childhood has a huge impact in what she makes and how she makes it now.
Yeah, and I think her work being born out of sex but not being sexual is an interesting element to the episode. There's a piece of work that I researched that's called Accumulation #1, and it was done in 1962. and it's an armchair. There's quite a few different sculptures, but one of them was the armchair, and it's covered in hand-sewn and painted phalluses. So you've got, I think one was like a rowboat, and there was another chair maybe, and there's hundreds of these cloth penises that are all over this armchair.
Really interesting material choice as well.
Flaccid.
Because you can sew into cardboard, but choosing something that is flaccid and soft and malleable, like cloth,
and also functional as an armchair, technically.
Yeah.
If you were to, obviously, probably don't do that, get you in a bit of trouble. But
yeah, if you go and see her work,
don't go to a gallery and just sit on the artworks. But it was this. So Kusama sought comfort in the repetition of things, which is what you see later on
with her polka dots. And
and the infinity rooms, things like that. And I think there was this oversaturation of penises to kind of take the power away from them. So I got this article from Creative Boom, and Midori Yoshimoto said that she castrates the power associated with phalli, turning them into benign elements that decorate women's domestic space. So this idea that it just takes all of the... Because when you see, like, a naked penis for the first time, or a naked person for the first time, it's a bit jarring.
Oh, incredibly.
If someone just, like, flashes you, it's frightening, it's scary.
Well, and, you know, like, the law has changed, so flashing somebody, which is, of course, always without consent, is sexual assault. So, very, very interesting to essentially be flashing your audience, but removing all of the power.
You're flashing them hundreds and hundreds of times to the point where what you're seeing becomes so unsurprising.
Which feels like a metaphor for the incredibly patriarchal society we still live in. We're kind of overly exposed to men, male penises.
And I think as well, this idea of them being flaccid, where an erect penis has the power to penetrate, has the power. It has power.
Has power.
Yeah.
Has power, and that's the problem.
And I think having this flaccid material, flaccid penises, having it in a domestic object, which makes it boring.
Yeah, boring.
It just makes it less visually shocking.
But that kind of reminds me of what we were saying about the ancient Greeks. How they had genitalia and sexual positions and sexual depictions, or nude depictions, on household items. And that is essentially what Kusama has done. But it seems and feels to be born out of a different narrative.
Absolutely.
And that's really, really interesting, because if you do have a look at some of ancient Greek household items, cutlery, for example, that is either carved into, engraved, or sculpted on, with these kind of sexual or nude images, it feels born out of pleasure. They feel sort of born out of, like, yeah, this is what we do, we're sexual people, and it was very, very normal. Whereas you look at Kusama's work, and it isn't born out of that at all.
It's different sides of the same coin, isn't it? The sex coin we all have.
We all have a sex coin.
We all have the sex coin that we spend when we lose our virginity. That's what's... And then the stalk comes down.
When you give yourself away.
So with the ancient Greek things, it was very, very normal, and it was very comfortable, and there was a lot of religious elements as well, which kind of added to that comfort. You
don't feel a sense of comfort from knowing Kusama's story. You might find a sense of comfort in her work, because she does.
Yes, absolutely. She uses it's almost like exposure therapy.
And that kind of sense of comfort can come from how normal something looks when you look at it 100 times, especially in one room.
Absolutely.
Like, if you were to see one wall in one house with polka dot wallpaper, you'd probably be like, that stands out and that's a bit weird. No offence if you're a polka dot wallpaper person. However, if you walk into a house that every single wall exclusively has wallpapered polka dots on it, you would be like, oh, this becomes normal.
You're not going to remember one dot.
No. You're just going to be like, that's what that house looks like. And that's what you kind of feel when you explore Kusama's work.
Absolutely. And especially in the 60s as well, where, you know, women were being on the pill and were being sexually liberated. There was lots of things that were being very, very sex positive. Yeah. And I think this work being so jarring in a way and being kind of very anti-sex might have been a bit against the grain at the time because of how sexually liberated everyone else was at the time.
Yes.
And how the trajectory of where society was going with exploration of sexuality and queerness being more accepted.
Yes.
Slowly but surely, baby steps. I mean, we're still a little bit backwards today. But
yeah, a little bit. A little bit. So yeah, she's fantastic artist to look at, and of course, from our perspective, as painters, we engage with her installation, her sculptural work, her handcrafted is how her work feels. In a very interesting way. I also don't feel like her work would connect if it was on a 2-dimensional canvas, you know? So some really interesting things to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this brings us on to the next artist I was looking to speak about. So I was thinking about Keith Haring's work, and he really hit the nail on the head, because I was thinking a lot about the graphic symbols he uses. And you've got... So there was the very famous Crack is Wack billboard that he made. And there was also a lot of stuff in the peak of the AIDS epidemic of practicing safe sex. And you've got 2 erect guys, supposedly, obviously raceless, genderless, and arguably sexless. You've got 2 figures
with erect penises
wanking each other off.
Yeah.
And there's no sex in that. There's no sexualness towards that.
Yeah.
I saw a lithograph actually, and it's of a giant condom with a face. It's a giant knob with a face that's holding a condom, and it says safe sex, like practice safe sex.
Right, okay.
And it's this there's almost like a light-hearted element, but what I was thinking about when I was doing research about this yesterday was this sexless element of his graphic, kind of pornographic lithographs. That's a bit of a mouthful. Well, I think that was potentially deliberate because of how serious he wanted to be about safe sex and about queerness and about AIDS, of taking the fun part of sex out of it and being serious.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't sexual, but it was very involved with sex.
Yes. And this also, strangely, but I think it's relevant, reminds me of Francis Bacon.
Absolutely.
Because Bacon and Haring made work pretty much at the same time.
God, that's weird with the timeline, isn't it?
It is. And so did Alice Neel, Keith Haring, Francis Bacon, Lucien Freud.
At some point, we're all painting at the same time.
We're all painting at the same time, which is really cool. Now, no shade on Francis Bacon himself.
Yeah.
Fantastic artist. Horrible paintings. But I'm going to elaborate on why I've decided to use that word.
Yeah.
I remember being exposed to Bacon's practice and his paintings when I was about 15 or 16. And I really, really struggled to look at it, because a lot of Bacon's work is charged by violence and trauma.
You can, feel a bit gross looking at them.
Yeah.
I can't absorb lots of his work at once. I can, feel his shame.
Yes.
About being a suspected queer person.
I don't think Keith Haring had that kind of shame. It wasn't
Not
about
at all.
having shame. But they both handled sex in what they made, in how they worked, but it translated differently.
Absolutely.
So you got these kind of iconographic, sort of thick, bold line pieces that were educational and funny, but also incredibly important during the AIDS epidemic from Keith Haring. But you were also getting these shame-filled, very kind of emotively painted, quite difficult to absorb pieces from Francis Bacon, both stemming from the experiences and ultimately the oppression of queer people.
Absolutely, because I think with Haring's work of going back to those two figures masturbating one another, it was explicit, but it wasn't sexual.
Yes.
And I think with Francis Bacon's work, it was very sexually charged, but there's not really any genitalia present.
It's not overly explicit.
No, it just feels gross.
Yes, yeah, it really, really does. And that's why he was such a fantastic artist.
And I feel
because he made us feel, and that's what we were talking about at the start of the episode.
Yeah.
There is no such thing, in our opinion, as really good or really bad art. There is such a thing as having art that you don't engage with because you're not feeling anything because of it. And you've got art that you are feeling all of the feelings about, whether that be positive or negative or happy or sad or emotional or aggressive reaction, you're reacting. And that's very much who we are as people. And we're trying to describe artists and look at works that are making us react.
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether something makes you... If something makes you furious, that's a good thing. That's usually that's the intent of a piece.
And a lot of what we've kind of summarised with Keith Haring and Francis Bacon's work really was the foundation of my practice. It's really what my practice was born out of. I remember just seeing so many artists from before, but particularly from the 20th century, who could not be themselves because being gay was illegal. Trans people did not have rights, especially in the UK. Lesbian women were not even recognised as lesbian women. That wasn't even deemed a thing. Of course, I was exposed to the AIDS epidemic through educational television. I mean, Russell T Davies, who's the original showrunner for Doctor Who from 2005, he's just come back. He also wrote It's a Sin.
Yes.
Sin?
Yeah.
He wrote It's a Sin. He also wrote the original Cucumber and Banana. He also wrote... Is it Queer as Folk? He also wrote Queer as Folk. I watched Queer as Folk probably when I was a little bit too young, but I owe a lot of my initial queer exposure and education to Russell T Davies, because that man encapsulated so beautifully what queer experience is and was like. When he wrote and released It's a Sin, it broke hearts across the nation. It broke hearts all over the world. If you haven't watched it, go and watch it. It is an artwork in of itself. And what that did for me is it showed me how rough it's been. Like, how bad things have been, and how challenging and how heartbreaking things have been for queer people. And I genuinely could have chosen to navigate my practice to make work about how hard it is being queer. Yeah. And how difficult it is being trans. But what I felt that I didn't get from looking at other artists and other programs and, other writings was there wasn't as much comfort as I wanted, because not a lot of it was great. Yeah. So...
You don't necessarily want to be reminded of how hard it is to be who you are. You know that.
So I started to make work about intimacy and about love, even at a time where I didn't actually know what being in love was. Yeah. And I started to make work about my identity and the identity of other queer people, and like what touch is like as a queer person. One of the first things I painted when this narrative really started to inform my practice about 5 years ago was like the simple touch of a hand on a chest. And I found something in that. I found a comfort and a drive and like this beautiful, beautiful subject matter. And then I kind of, it was like a big fucking snowball down a hill after that.
You're like a gentle touch, a knob in the mouth, and then...
Come drizzling down the chin.
And then we're going to go back to the lovely, tender, beautiful intimate. But it's all in the realm of sex, and it's all in the realm of queerness as well.
And it all stems from oppression.
This brings me on to a very lovely quote that I found yesterday from the Keith Haring Foundation. I think this was... I don't know if it's the article name, but it was from the page Sex is Life is Sex, which I thought was a great...
It's a great article to find.
And it described Haring's work that cries from the heart and calls for deliverance, the complexity of human relations where force, seduction, attraction, desire, degradation, self-destruction and self-development run very closely together. So his work was so much more than just sexual and graphic. It had so much emotion in it with having so little detail.
And what Keith Haring encapsulates within his work is this desire to make it simple, which is why it's lacking in detail. Yeah. It's like that desire to be like, it isn't this complicated. It's how I feel about trans rights, especially in the UK and the US, very Western kind of issues going on right now. It doesn't have to be this difficult. It doesn't have to be this hard.
I think stripping away the identities of his figures by making them just the outlines of people. It could be anyone. It could be anyone of any race, any sexual identity.
We're all born naked, the rest is drag. And I think...
nakedness...
Yeah.
Is...
And the nakedness that you find in Keith Haring's work is... Because it's not, like, realistically naked, and it's not skin tone, but it doesn't need to be.
No, it's graphic.
There's no drag there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I love so much about Haring's work, is that this evoking of really complex emotions, sexual emotions relating to queerness and identity is conveyed out of something so stripped back and so simple.
Absolutely.
And I love that.
So...
We've gone to the 60s. We went to ancient Greece.
Yeah.
And Keith Haring, Alice Neel was
we
kind
talked
of 1980s.
A lot about, yeah, we talked a lot about the 20th century.
So I want to maybe go in the middle of that. I want to go to the 1940s.
Stunning.
And I would like to talk about one of my all-time favourite painters, the father of Surrealist, René Magritte. So, as a...
Or Magritte, if you picture him as a cat.
Perfect. We've got all audiences covered. So, René Magritte had, similar to Kusama, had a very, very, very tragic life.
Yeah.
Had a very rough start to life. And essentially, he witnessed his mother being fished out of a river after she drowned herself when he was 14. So, his mother killed herself, and then he saw the aftermath of that. And when he saw her being fished out of the water, her nightgown was tangled around her face, and her bare body, dead, was left exposed. And as a 14-year-old boy coming into the world and seeing that...
That is very informative, to say the least.
Absolutely. You're being slapped in the face with the exposure of anything and everything. So discretion is advised, essentially. So this painting that he made, pictured above, is called The Rape. And it's a painting of a woman's face, portrait of a woman's face, and it replaces her facial features with sexual organs. So instead of the eyes, there are breasts. Instead of the nose, it's a navel. And instead of the mouth, it's pubis / vagina. So it was a response to his mother's suicide because that's what he saw. But also part of the reason I find it really interesting is because the undertone is how the man views woman.
Yes.
You're looking at a woman's face, but you're not seeing her face. You're seeing her naked body.
Yeah, you're not seeing her.
You're seeing an exposure of genitalia. You're seeing an exposure of very private and sacred parts that you want to be, that are naked. And like the hair is meant to be, is quite messy in an odd shape. It represents pubic hair, some people say. So this was something that was a very, very striking painting when you look at it, because at first glance it looks like a kind of run-of-the-mill portrait. Then you look into it and actually the gaze that are like breasts as eyes, and it represents a face. It's so easy to stare at and look into. And then some people argue as well, because the hair represents pubic hair and the neck's quite long and curved and the shape of the head, it's this idea of the sort of the head and shoulders penetrating as well. There's another element of that with the title as well, with the rape. It's almost like it's assaulting your vision. It's assaulting the painting. There's a lot of aggression, and it's quite an ugly painting, but it's something that you can look at for a long time. And I think with a lot of Magritte's work and a lot of surrealist work, there's a lot of this, it's kind of painted in almost kind of no man's land. It's very in between worlds, this sort of dreamlike state where the background might be, it's quite hard to gauge where it is. And it was something that when I was doing research about art and sex, and, you know, we could talk about Andy Warhol's piss paintings and cum paintings and things like that.
Which I'm sure we will one day.
But the things that I was looking at when it came to the idea of sex and art is that I thought that was a really interesting painting to talk about because of the title.
Yes, because we can talk about empowerment and we can talk about sexual identity, but there is another element to sex, which isn't sex at all, and that is assault.
Absolutely.
And I imagine for him, in his trauma, as we sort of said earlier about, you know, Yayoi Kusama, your trauma informing your art practice, that exposure could have felt like a rape for him.
Absolutely.
And that's where this piece was born out of.
Yeah, and I think when you're thinking about sex and when you're talking about sex, there's this idea of it being... There's lots of different ways that you can... There's lots of different, like, names that sex falls under. There's, like, making love, and there's fucking. And, like, the difference in that language and how charged it is and what that represents. You know, with an artist like Tracy Emin, where she makes work about... this was the first time I've made love in 6 years and it's beautiful and tender, and then she goes, I was fucked and I was left. It really changes the perspective on sexuality and the sexualness of it all. Which
I also think for us as artists, we take a lot from this because it's a big part of the reason I do paint things so beautiful that depict very, very beautiful images. And I also think it's why you, Sophie, paint things that are nude without being sexual.
Absolutely. I think this idea of this vulnerable form, I want a vulnerable form to be vulnerable without this idea of, like, when they're going to have sex.
Yeah.
I think that sex is important, and some people think sex is everything. But like we were saying about how we're very, very different painters, like, we've got very different outlooks to sex. Like, I've been there when it's happened. Yeah. But, like, it's not something that I necessarily wear as part of my identity. And it's not necessarily something that I particularly, if at all, like, mention or talk about in my art. Because I just, for me, I don't think it's necessary. I think that maybe I've got a subconscious idea that as a woman, I'm a bit worried that that's going to be an undertone anyway, so I don't want to give any more attention and time to it. Yeah, and I think that's definitely a very big topic that will probably go into a lot more detail in our identity episode. Absolutely. So, absolutely come back for that one. Closing statements. This is our first time doing this ever. Yes. This is our first podcast. This is our first video recording. This will be our first YouTube video. Apart from maybe the ones that we made as children. Yeah. What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. Yeah, we don't want it to be that. But we hope that you have found this informative. We hope that what we've talked about gives you a really good understanding about who we are and how we work and the things that we just enjoy. So... we'll be releasing our episodes on mostly a weekly basis. Yes. I am going to put above or below what our Instagram, our TikTok, our YouTube, and our podcast link is for, like, Apple Music and Spotify. Yep, absolutely. For our podcast listeners, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us. Yeah, this has been... as a first experience, I was a bit worried... because with something like a podcast, you always want to make sure you're going to be interesting enough and fun enough. Yeah, so if we haven't been, I'm sorry. If no one has got to this point, I completely understand. That's no worries whatsoever. But this has been something that this is something that I would really like to continue doing. Yes. Say that this is honestly something that I've had such a love for art for my entire life. Yes. And I feel like this being a platform for us to talk about things and for us to share our thoughts and opinions and experience. I'm so happy that we're doing this. So if you do want to support us, like our videos, follow our social media. Just tell us what you think. Tell us you enjoyed it. And tell other people. Tell other people about us and get more people listening. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. And we hope you have a lovely rest of your day, rest of your evening. And we'll chat to you guys next week. Yeah, we'll see you guys soon. Bye. Bye.